Great Lakes Prepping here. In the past, I've made videos about vacuum sealing and freezing all sorts of things. And today, I've got another one of those videos for you. We've done vegetables, pasta, chicken, and tons of other things. And today, we're doing chops and steaks. That's pork chops and beef steaks. Both vacuum seal and freeze pretty much the same way, and both have very similar options for a couple different things you can do should you want to when vacuum sealing and freezing them. So I'll keep the intro short and jump right in and take a look at the meat we're going to be vacuum sealing today. So here's the meat we're going to be vacuum sealing today. Here I've got two pretty good thick New York strip steaks and also two really thick bone-in pork chops. Now this method works no differently if you've got those kind of thin, ordinary, borderline sad looking pork chops you get at the regular grocery store. But by the way, if you have the choice, go to a butcher shop or a real meat market and get yourself some of these monster thick ones. The taste and the tenderness makes all the difference in the world. But enough of my 2 cents and my little pork chop soapbox. We're here today to talk about vacuum sealing this meat. Now, as I see it, there's pretty much 3 ways that we can do this. Now, all 3 are pretty much the same thing, just 3 slightly different preparations. The first is we vacuum seal our meat just like this, a raw piece of meat in a vacuum seal bag, just like that. The second would be to pre-season the meat. Salt, pepper, whatever seasonings, flavorings you want, even a sprig of thyme or rosemary or whatever you prefer, with the meat right in the vacuum seal bag. That option is kind of popular for people that intend to sous vide the meat right in the same vacuum seal bag. And the third, kind of along those same lines, vacuum sealing it in the bag in marinade. That would be a liquid marinade that goes right in the bag with the cut of meat. Freeze it. When you thaw it out, it's still marinating in that liquid, ready to go on the grill or in the oven or whatever. Now, when I vacuum seal meat, I definitely have a preferred of those 3 methods, and that's to seal them just like this, just the plain piece of raw meat. And that's simply because I want to decide what to make at the time I'm making it. And what I mean by that is, if I was to go ahead and season this steak up with a certain combination of dry seasonings or marinate a pork chop in a certain marinade, I've pretty much decided right now how I'm going to make and eat that piece of meat weeks or months later when I go to thaw it out and cook it. And I don't want today me making decisions for future me when it comes to what I'm going to have for dinner. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with thawing this meat out, seasoning it or marinating it however I want at the time, on the day I'm going to cook it. But some people really like to prepare as many things as possible in advance, and it's perfectly okay to do that. For me, I like to just go plain raw meat in the vacuum seal bags. Now let's talk a little bit about the vacuum sealing machine and the sealing bags. This is my FoodSaver vacuum seal machine. It's a pretty small model, very basic, but I've had old Betsy here going on, I gotta say, about 11 years. I've sealed thousands of bags and jars with this thing. I couldn't even possibly count how many. And it's always held up just fine. It still seals. I think it might be running a little slower than it used to. But I tell you what, if this thing ever breaks, I would have no problem going out and buying the exact same one or whatever the closest model to this one is that they currently make. And the operation couldn't really be simpler. We put our food product in the bag. We line the bag up right along this little groove, this little trough in the machine. Close it, lock it, hit the button. But before we do that, let's discuss the bag options that we have. They make these FoodSaver vacuum seal bags in all manner of different shapes and sizes, and a ton of different companies make them nowadays. You don't necessarily have to buy the FoodSaver brand or whatever, and I've used a lot of the cheapo knockoff brands, and pretty much all of them have worked just fine for me. But I will say that even though they make all these different sized bags, this one of course would be much too small for the big pieces of meat we're doing today. They also make these great big giant, I don't even know what this is, I guess a gallon sized bag. And this is going to be quite a bit bigger than what we need today. And since it's usually the case that the bags that they sell aren't going to be just right for what you need to seal that day, I like to actually go with the roll. And they make wider rolls and narrower rolls. This is the one that I tend to use the most often. I don't know, what is that, about 8 inches wide? and I can just unroll as much as I want, cut it to the length of bag that I need, and I can go ahead and just seal one end of this bag to get started. So I now have an actual bag and not just a sleeve of plastic. And I do that by laying one end of the bag in the sealer, closing it, locking it, and hitting just that seal button. I don't need to vacuum it yet. I'm just trying to seal this one open end. When it's done, you can see it's created this nice sealed line right here, and now my bag is ready to use. So I'll go ahead and pre-cut and pre-seal 4 of these since I have 4 pieces of meat to seal today. All right, so I've got my 4 bags ready to go. And by the way, I do definitely want to make sure to cut my bags a bit longer than what I actually need. I might have gone a little too long on this one. You certainly want to have at least a solid 2 to 3 inches left over at the end so you can actually set it into the machine without your piece of meat or whatever obstructing the lid of that machine from closing. But too big is okay, too small doesn't work. And you know, if after I put the piece of meat in here, it seems like there's just way more overhang than I really need, I could go ahead and trim it up a little bit with the scissors. But too big isn't really gonna hurt anything. And when it's all sealed flat, it's not really gonna take up any more noticeable amount of room in your freezer because it's just gonna be this flat, paper thin end over here. So with these chops of meat, it really couldn't be any more straightforward. We just stick them in the bag. These pieces of meat are hardy and firm enough that they're not gonna really deform or get squished or mashed through the sort of vacuum effect of the bag being sucked completely tight. Whereas if you had something like sausages or ground meat, where you might not want it to be completely mangled and squeezed by that bag, I would recommend flash freezing first, which is what I do with all my sausages. Once my sausage link is quite solidified from the freezer, then I'll go ahead and put it in the vacuum seal bags because I'm not worried about them being squished from the sealing. But for these chops and steaks, no such thing is necessary. All I'm gonna do is kind of pop this bag so it stays a little bit open at the end, and then go ahead and drop my steak right in there, help it in a little bit. And it's good. So then I'll just go ahead and repeat the same thing for my other steak and my 2 pork chops. And I just like to make sure that the piece of meat is pretty well all the way at the bottom of the bag. That way, if I do have a bunch of excess that I trim off, I can get a good kind of gauge of how much I can cut. And it definitely looks like I got a little carried away when I cut the lengths of some of these. So I will go ahead and trim these up just a little bit. Now we're just gonna kind of make sure that the end of this stays cinched closed as we lay it really flat on the edge of the machine. Again, making sure that the very opening of the bag kind of overlaps and hangs over this little plastic trough. Close the lid, lock it with the little lever, and hit the vacuum and seal button, which is one button, vac/seal. And after it sucks as much air out as it can, it will automatically go into the sealing cycle, which is heating up a little element right here that basically melts the opening of the bag closed. When it's done, the green light will turn on. And there we have it. Perfectly vacuum sealed steak ready for the freezer. And now we just do the same thing with the chops and the other steak. Like I said earlier, you just want to make sure that there's definitely plenty of room to close this lid. If you have too little of a lip on the end here, you'll try to shut that lid and it's going to hit your chop, and you're going to have to basically scrap that bag and get a new one. And that's it. 4 beautifully vacuum sealed pieces of meat. I'll write today's date on each package with a magic marker, throw them in the freezer, and I'm good to enjoy these weeks or months from now or longer. A couple quick final notes. 1, if sometime between now and when I stick these in the freezer, if I notice that it seems like some of the plastic is becoming a little bit loose and not totally sucked in against that meat, I have to assume that somewhere in this bag a seal has failed. Maybe the bag didn't quite melt perfectly and create the seal or something like that. And I definitely want to make sure it's good and sealed before I go into the freezer. And that loose plastic is pretty indicative that it is not sealed perfectly. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen occasionally. And I'll just go ahead and cut the bag open, put the piece of meat in a new bag, reseal it. I'd say maybe 1 out of 20 or 30 bags and seals I have that happen to. Not a big deal. These rolls of plastic are pretty cheap, so I'm not worried about it. And by the way, if you want to check out these exact rolls of vacuum seal bag that I use, check out the video description below. I've been buying this one brand for actually quite some time, and I've had really good luck with them, and the price, you really can't beat it. And the last thing I'll mention, earlier I talked about the idea of vacuum sealing your piece of meat in marinade, which you can definitely do, and I definitely have done. But the problem with that is that when you have a bunch of liquid kind of in here, when you put it in the vacuum seal machine, the vacuum suction action of it pulling that air out is going to want to try to pull some of that liquid out with it. And then you're going to have sort of a mess of liquid in your machine. But more importantly, that liquid is going to prevent a good seal from melting into the bag. And I'll use this steak as an example because it was pretty juicy, and you can see, well, maybe you can see on the camera, a lot of the juice from that steak actually started to pull up towards the machine, and it didn't end up obstructing my seal, so I'm gonna have no problem. But if there was much more liquid than that, it would have. So what you can do about that is they make some vacuum seal bags like this that actually have sort of embedded strip of this absorbent material. And as the suction of the machine tries to draw moisture up towards the machine, it will pretty much get trapped and absorbed into this strip, and it'll never make it to the machine. And when your seal is up here, the seal will be unobstructed, and you'll have a successful seal. Now these bags I have, somebody sent these to me to try out, and they're pretty huge, so they don't end up getting used for a lot in my repertoire. If you have a whole lot of meat to seal all at once, especially if you are marinating, you might have a whole bunch of marinade, you want to make use of it, throw a whole bunch of meat in there. But they also make smaller versions of these bags with that absorbent strip in them. Pretty cool invention, I guess, that is definitely handy if you've got a really wet thing you're trying to vacuum seal. So a pretty straightforward operation. When it comes to vacuum sealing, it really doesn't get any easier than a pork chop or a piece of steak or a piece of chicken. Really any raw, unground piece of meat, put it in the bag, seal it up, throw it in the freezer. As long as the air is all sucked out and that bag seals, it's more or less foolproof. So check out the description below, see the links to the vacuum seal rolls. I'll put a link to the machine that I use here, this old workhorse FoodSaver that I've had forever. And be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future food preservation videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.